Well, good morning, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I was reflecting this morning about this meeting and realizing that we had 5 meetings planned, and this is the 4th of 5, which I was just like, gasp. Suddenly, it feels like the fire is at our feet, and we want to make sure that we are making progress towards our goals. So with that in mind, I am actually going to pivot and toss things to Susan to kind of go through where we are. We've kind of modified, and she'll talk a little bit about this. We've modified our format a little bit today to really try to make sure that we're harvesting all of the good ideas and wisdom that you all bring to the table from your various vantage points. And so I just want to thank you for that. I think it's going to be a really interesting and engaging conversation. So Susan.
Thanks, Londe. Welcome, everybody. It seems unbelievable that we're on meeting 4, but here we are. And so, Colette, if you could advance us to slide 2. You've seen this a bunch of times already, but I want to orient you to where we are in the process. So obviously, today is October 27th, and we are going to be doing things a little bit different today. But by the end of today, what we want to be able to walk away with are your priorities for the work that we want to put forward, the big solutions that we want to put forward, and understanding as to what you think is going to make the difference for the students that we've prioritized in this work, and some guidance on where you want us to work with the work groups to continue to flesh out some of the work that's yet to happen. And we'll continue working with them in the background so that when we get together on November 10th, what we are doing is checking solutions, looking for impact, doing all of that work together. So as a result, and we have a little bit different format on our agenda today. So Colette, if you could go to the next slide. We're going to spend some time talking about some insights from our National Task Force members. So Deb and Michelle are going to spend some time in conversation with Londe. We're going to have put out a special call for our national partners to continue to push us today in our thinking. We're going to have a break for a few minutes, and then we're going to have a really open conversation on the materials that we sent you yesterday. What we provided to you is kind of the overall list of big ideas and smaller ideas that have come forward in the work. And we want to have an open-ended conversation with all of you so that you can tell us, do you think these are the things that would get it done, that would make a significant difference for Black students, for Latinx students, for adult students as we move forward in California? Is there anything that is absolutely non-negotiable on that list that you think we must do if we are going to achieve that work? And are there things on that list that you think are a lesser priority that we shouldn't spend as much time on? And that guidance will help us and the working groups pull that work together much more concretely using your guidance in order to take us to prepare for coming back to you with a much more concrete select set of moonshots going forward. So that's our task today. It's not an easy one, but get ready to talk. And I think in our transmittal yesterday, we encouraged you to either have the slides next to you, either electronically or in print, so that you have those to refer to throughout our conversation. Great. So we're going to have that open-ended conversation. We will probably take a break at some point within it if we need to pivot, if we need to go into small groups, whatever makes sense given what we're hearing from you is what we'll do. So we'll be nimble on our feet. And then finally, we'll wrap things up and head on to next steps. So given that and where we are, I'm going to turn it back to Londe to move us to the next piece of our agenda.
Great. So what we want to do is, again, we want to make sure that those of us in California who have some opportunity to speak with one another on a regular basis get to hear the wisdom from our national partners sitting with us around this table. So we asked both Michelle and Deborah if they would spend some time in conversation with me, and I think we can take this slide down after we show their pretty faces. If they would spend some time just talking a little bit about their work and some key lessons that they think are significant for California students and institutions to be paying attention to. So, so I wanted to actually just start, and I think we can, since we'll be in conversation, asking the question that I like to ask before we get into any formal questions of them, which is, when you got a note saying, hey, can you come be on this task force that's focused on California? Michelle and Deborah, why did you say yes? You both have plenty of other things to do. So I'm really curious as to what made it seem compelling enough for you to say yes.
Uh-oh.
Let's start with Michelle.
Hi, so I don't think my audio on the computer is working, so hopefully you can still hear me just fine. But I said yes because a couple of different reasons. One is, you know, I'm very committed to this work, and I think it's a really important work, and California is an important state. And when I looked at the title, it really did sum up what I think the charge is, and it sort of just even spurred my desire to be involved, and that's, you know, recovery with equity. And as we move towards a moment where we are sort of moving through the COVID-19 pandemic experience and moving beyond that, as we seek to recover, we have to come out of this pandemic different than what we came into it with. And a focus on equity and being very intentional about that is going to be super important. And for a state like California to take up the mantle and say that is the charge and that is how we're going to move forward was an exciting and worthwhile endeavor to be involved in.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Deborah?
So I'll add to that. First, California, Latinx population. How could I not, despite the millions of things that I'm doing? Look, frankly, what happens in California is the bellwether of things it can do. Right or wrong for those other people, we've got to get it right, and this is the place to do it. And I believe that's been the case for a long time. So I so appreciate the forward thinking that continues in this space to help others. Second, it allows me to think outside the national picture in DC, and that's just exhausting because even trying to convince people that this is a population, students of color matter, is not easy or the norm. And I'm tired of being my head up all the time. I can just do it partially. I think the other is I felt an affinity because, you know, it's the very reason we started Excellency in Education was we believe we have to be part of the solution, and that we are reflective of what more of us are than not. Yeah. And that, you know, we are an asset, we are an opportunity, we are the contributors of the present and the future and the past. And to not see that on an agenda, on a stage, in conversation, I think is unconscionable. So if I can be a part of something that's doing that, I'm happy to do so. You know, you don't have to wash your toilet bowl every other day. You can do those things elsewhere. This is more important than that kind of stuff. So, you know, the daily grind sometimes has to give way to the things that matter more. And this to me matters more.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Londe, I'm gonna just toss in one more truth about this whole experience is you were the person who asked. And I have worked with you long enough to know that if you're going to be involved, it's going to be done with a spirit and level of excellence and thoroughness. And so far that has proven to be true. So I'm just thrilled to be here. So thank you for thinking to invite me, Deb, and others who are on the national scene.
Well, you know, it's like having a party with all your friends, so why not? No, and I'm really enjoying the space because they are both new friends, which I'm very excited about, as well as some old friends. You know, I want to ask, because one of the things that I've been doing since we've had this task force is I've been trying to reach out to various members of you for some one-on-one time, because some of you are friends, but other of you I actually didn't know. I've just admired your work from afar. And in a recent conversation I had with someone on the task force, we were having a conversation about what you named, Michelle, which was the title of this task force, Recovery with Equity. And I'm curious to know, when you were thinking about the task force, were you thinking more about what it meant for us to be leaning in on the recovery side? Were you thinking more about what it means for us to be leaning in more on the equity side? Are those two things blended? And how how do those two concepts relate to one another as we think about the work that's in front of us?
Yeah, so I think for me, all the work that I do it with a lens towards equity. And so when I talk about equity, I am really talking about doing things in a way that rights the wrongs of previous generations, that looks at a fair and righteous path forward. And I think if we're going to do anything in the post-recovery world, it's got to be done with equity. I don't care what it is. And so for me, the two are not sort of, it's not one or the other. It's an and. Like, we've got to be thinking about the recovery. We've got to be thinking about doing things in a better way than we had done them before.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll just add to that. From my perspective, Linda, I'll just say that, I think equity has to come first over recovery. We can, I think the presumption that we can just figure something out and just recover despite it is what we've been in for way too long. And we haven't had the critical conversations and the uncomfortable part of being equity minded. So for me, I just disagree.
I think that's
and equity is about race. I want to be clear about that too, and I know that's true for Deborah as well. She and I work together a lot, so it's about racial equity first. It's also about economic equity, but I think that we typically like to sweep the racial part of the equity conversation under the rug, or we just use equity as a banner, and then it becomes a catch-all for just about anything. And I want to be abundantly clear that I think as we move forward, we've got to be explicit about the need to think about racial equity as our priority.
It's great. I mean, I think that's right. And I think that in this case, the equity is really modified by recovery, because part of the question I think that I've been thinking about is that, the challenges that as you name it, that students who are Black and Latinx are facing are much deeper than the ones they were facing a year ago. And so we really want to make sure that we are being increasingly intentional about identifying those solutions that are going to help them not just move through this period of the pandemic, right? But that are going to actually help them be in a much better place than they were a year ago. So I want to make sure that we're holding both of those concepts. I'd love to hear, and maybe we'll start with you this time, Deborah, from your work, what you think the key, if you had to choose one thing that you think this task force needed to be doing or needed to be paying attention to, what is that thing? What's the non-negotiable for you? What's the big picture strategy that California needs to adopt if we want to have a more equitable system for students when we are through the crisis that we're currently in?
I always ask that question. Thanks for throwing it back at me in that regard. Like I will say, equity has to be the design element. It cannot be the add-on. And too often our policy conversations, it is the add-on. It's okay, we get this fixed, and then what does it mean for this group or this population as a footnote? So to me, not trying to skirt in the question, but I appreciate that the framing has to be that, because everything falls from that, because then constantly saying, what does this mean for our Black students? What does it mean for our Latinx? That's part of it. The second part is, I think it's about, so that's the framing. The action has to be about institutional transformation from my perspective. It's the structural inequities. That goes beyond just policy and even investment. That means that institutions have to dismantle those the structural elements that have perpetuated this. And what does that mean from my perspective? Excelencia, a small organization, is that we start with the coalition of the willing that are willing to have these uncomfortable, difficult conversations about what institutional transformation means, to have that equity lens, and come up with plans of how do we take apart each one by putting our students of color first rather than last, and restructuring and redesigning. And I think that the ideas, the moonshot, I keep thinking about how we got a man on the moon back in the day, and things were not off the table, but everything had to be vetted through that. Were we going to meet that goal? We left lots of good ideas on the side to meet that goal. And we prioritized things that maybe were more fringe previously. So that's from my perspective, and I'm happy to get into more of that. Where I think if we don't frame it right, and if we don't have the goal of structural change, everything else is playing around the edges.
Right. So the goal is, the goal is important. Structural change, deep redesign in systems is important. What's the one thing, if you had to choose only one thing, is there one thing that you think that the institutions would have to do to get the equity piece right? Is there one intervention that you would look at? Is there one moonshot that you would throw out?
I mean, trying not to sound pedantic, because I appreciate you're pushing for that kind of stuff. In my end of the world, I fundamentally think it's about financial aid, and that it's not financial aid, it's the cost, the affordability. I would ultimately go there because that is such a critical barrier in so many ways. And there's so many parts of financial aid that we need to redesign. I think that would help our adult learners and our adults and others. So if it were financial aid, I would say, how do we make sure that this is not just about tuition and fees, that this is about the entire being, the holistic approach, and that financial support is not the barrier, the excuse, the rationale for not meeting our needs. And that means not just free, because I think that, and we can have a whole bunch of conversations about that, but the financial redesign of our higher education system, I think would have significant impact on the equity because we address that.
You would look at some fundamental reforms to California financial aid, for example, that would encompass, I'm putting words in your mouth, just it's not good for me. I'm going to put words in your mouth, but that would encompass the total cost of attendance for students and for the neediest students, right? So that's not the barrier that prevents them from moving through.
I mean, I think yes, but I think we have to go further. I think we have to redesign how we finance, how we fund, how we support institutions, not just the money we give to the students at the end of the day when we set our own price point. I think we have to think higher and bigger. That's why I'm sorry I keep going to the goal, because at the end of the day, the way we fund institutions, the way we do cost per student, how much money we have available for aid, all of that. I mean, you said moonshot, so, but if you ask for one intervention, I would say at the end of the day, I would prioritize students of color and those that have the most financial need. And I worry about that because the impact it has on the middle income that also need an education. But that to me is about social mobility. And I think we can advance as a society if we address social mobility and financially support that.
Great, that's terrific. Michelle, same question. What's the one thing that you would think that you have learned from IHEP that you would think that we need to do in California that's game changing?
So I don't think there's just one thing that you can do. I've asked people those kinds of questions. I know I've asked people those questions. They've asked me, and I just can't say one thing. I'm gonna give you three. Can I give you three?
You can give me three, but then I might make you prioritize one because you got to start somewhere.
Okay, you can make me go deeper on one, and I'm fine with that. But I just think that higher education is a complicated enterprise, and so it's impossible to think that we can just do one thing right and lead to that transformative institutional change that Deb was speaking to. But certainly, the one thing I think is really basic is you got to know your numbers. So anyone who knows anything about IHEP knows that we are advocates of good quality data. We believe in the power of disaggregated data, and we believe that our current data infrastructure is severely flawed, as it does not count all data, it does not count all outcomes, and it is overly burdensome and complex. But at the institutional level, institutions have, their own data, they have their own IR offices. But even when I go out and I meet with institutional leaders, I'm often I often see that not many people really have used their data, looked at their data in a manner that disaggregates their data to look at their outcomes by race and ethnicity or by income, and be able to talk about the challenges that are happening within the course of their institutions. I just believe that there's power in good data, and if you want to make progress, you've got to know your numbers. It's almost like, when you go to the doctor, at least before you went to the doctor back in before COVID, the doctor come in, and you do your blood pressure, you do your temperature, you do, what else you do? Blood pressure, temperature, and a little oxygen thing. Now they ask you a whole bunch of stuff before you even show up at the doctor's office, and they still do that. Or they do your weight, right? They do your weight. Like, I know my weight. I don't like the number, but I still know the number. And it's up to me to do something differently to change the course. And so that's what I tell institutional leaders. Like, you may not like what your data says at this moment, but you've got to own where you are and create a path forward with the numbers you have. So that's one thing. And I've appreciated the work of this task force because, that's where you started us with. You started us with data. Lots of data about the California context. And I would hope that others who are leaders in California know that data, and that at an institutional level, they are interrogating those same types of questions student by student, because each number does represent a person who has chosen to start at that institution and hopefully will be on a path towards success. So numbers are important. I'm alongside Deborah on the stance of finance. I think so much of our conversations about finance has focused on what we do on the back end, meaning what do we do to fix financial aid? How do we get more grant aid? What do we do about student loans? And I think all of that stuff's really important, but we've got to start looking at the financing issue on the front end. Like, why does it cost what it costs? And that is an institutional finance consideration. That is a tuition setting policy consideration. And that is something that I don't think that we are focused on enough. What are the true costs to students? And I think we've just been focusing on how do we get more into the student loans, or how can we fix the student loan system to make repayment more manageable? Well, we see that student loan debt repayment is a challenge even for many students who graduate, especially African Americans who struggle to repay their student loan debt 12 years after they enrolled in college in the first place. So this whole student loan issue is a big problem. It is one of the biggest challenges towards eliminating the racial wealth gap, but that is a problem that doesn't start at the end of college. It's a problem that starts at the beginning with why does it cost what it costs, and how can we fix that problem? And then my third one, I'm gonna just say, Londa, is around leadership. We've got to have the right people leading our institutions. I often say that, we need to have people who have compassion for the students, who are the students of today, but also have a can-do spirit and a willingness to serve them better. I do think we are trending in that direction with many of the leaders at our institutions, certainly the leaders at California institutions, but that's got to be a 100% proposition. We've got to have good leaders willing to do what it takes to make sure that we can put our students on the path they actually need to be on.
That's great. I mean, I was going to say, when you started with data, that data, you're right, is essential. And I'm a big advocate of strong data, but data by itself is not going to create the political will or the impetus to actually change actions and activities on campus. So I'm trying to get at is, how do we make sure that we are aligning the systems that we have, data, financial aid, around the strategies that we want to employ to actually move the needle for Black and brown kids and adults, not just the kids, but the adults too.
Right. As many of the adults of color don't have that degree, so it's not the same. I'll say this, our approach, and again, as a small organization, is that I could spend my entire time trying to convince people that we matter, that our population matters, that this lens matters, and maybe have a minimal impact. So we decided to start with the Coalition of the Willing, those that are willing to have these hard conversations and willing to rethink some of what they're doing, and see if we could imagine something differently. And it's a small group, but I think the tipping point idea, that if you get enough that are doing it differently and doing it well, that then it brings people on board. That's our attempt to contribute to this, because we did not get here as a country to this point where we've been ignoring and disenfranchising Black and brown communities for as long as we have. But there is so much happening and so much positive and innovation that we are not capitalizing on, because it's dealing with the populations that have the least attention and don't get the mic, and we're not paying attention to. And I see that on a regular basis. So we created an approach to say, let's reset the standard and expectation of what institutions are doing to intentionally serve. And frankly, because we're at the national level, that's our equity shot. We don't say equity, but I think it's a word that's misused too many times. People say equity at the national level. They're really talking at best diversity, representation, right? They're not talking about even inclusion, right? Which is just participation. And so I want to be as transparent as we can be. So can we talk about being intentional and serving our students of color? And then how do we think about that? And do so not to the exclusion of others, but starting with them instead of ending with them. And that framing, I think, Lande, I don't know that it's the full answer, but from my small part of the universe, it feels doable. And it is impressive to see how many people are committed to the very thing this task force is and are doing it on a day-to-day, in a program-to-program, student-to-student basis. That's what we want to amplify. That's where the asset, the positivity is. That I think that's where you build momentum, because I don't think you can create will from those that are absolutely committed against it.
I think that's exactly right. There's a colleague that we all have here in California, Ryan Smith, who I remember when I first met him, he used to go around saying, well, you know, equity is the new coconut water. And we have to be really, really careful about that, because you're right. Everyone's out there talking about equity and not really having a working understanding of what it means, how it would shift institutions, how it would shift power, how it would shift privilege, and that it means that I would actually get less because someone else is going to get more, and that's going to make all of us better off. And we don't want to actually have that conversation. So I think you're right that we have to be incredibly clear about what we are asking institutions to do and what that means, if in fact we're trying to promote equity. I'm going to have Michelle, I'm going to ask you both kind of this final question, and then we're going to pivot to questions from your colleagues here. So you guys can start thinking about your questions, either put them in the chat or raise your virtual hand. But the final question is, we have a bunch of ideas that have been floated up that you know, our colleagues at Education First have been dutifully cataloging and categorizing and helping us to make meaning of the conversations that we've had. What is compelling in that group to you, or what is missing? Is there something that you feel like this is all window dressing unless we do X? Or is there something that you feel like if we only do X, we will have hit the target, or we will have made a significant amount of progress? So Deb, did you have thoughts?
Yeah, this goes back to the fear of prioritizing what's the most compelling. You know, one of the things I appreciate about what the task force has discussed so far is it feels more holistic than any of the policy conversations we've had. And so I see the intersection and the alignment between them. And I know that's I'm not trying to be pedantic, but I do think that I love that it's not just about attainment. And I love that it's not just that we're bringing in the adult learners and the connection between K-12 and higher ed. But if I had to choose of the many things that I think are sexy about what we put in there, because if it's not sexy, it doesn't get a policy play, is I do think that the finance structure of higher ed and some of those suggestions, the business model that's redesigned to put students first and that we're willing to incur those, I think to me that seems the most viable. I think that's not the easiest though. And I'm biased. I think that the work connecting to the workforce gives, from the enlightened self-interest that we have to address in public policy, that's a timely one. So I like that as well. So, but I think that the finance restructuring is not easy, but I think in some ways it's the most meaningful if we can get traction there.
That's great. Michelle.
Yeah, so like Deborah, I do think that the work that we're doing here is really holistic, and that's a good thing. I strongly believe that in the intersection of policy and practice, I think, you know, in order for things to happen, you have to have people on the institutional level who are willing to do it. So that includes college presidents and faculty and staff members, administrators. But in order to see a systems change, I think you've got to address policy, and whether that's policy at the institutional level or policy at the state level, that is where we can really drive home things that will change and have lasting long-term change for hopefully generations to come. I think the points that I want us to continue to focus on is to not be fearful of the race conversation, to continue to make sure that as we are thinking about, you know, recovering with equity, that we are looking at race, especially when we see that not only are we dealing with a health pandemic, we're also dealing with the long-lasting ripple effects of a racial pandemic. And we have to address that and how it interacts with the health pandemic. It all comes back to the issue of race. So I want us to continue to focus on that, but I also want us to think about how all of that plays out in higher education. I often say that, higher ed is a microcosm of the broader world, or at least our institutions are a microcosm. And so what's happening in the world is happening at our institutions. And so we've got to be willing and able to address not just the learning and the curricula and all of that stuff, but the world is happening to our students, and they're bringing that reality to campus. And how do we provide those wraparounds, those supports, and all of that infrastructure to really support them on campus and beyond. And like Deborah, I mentioned this last week, that I'm all about the funding piece. I really do believe that as a nation, we often talk about how we don't have money for X and we don't have money for Y, but somehow we support and fund Z. And education is often the thing that we don't have the money for. And Deborah has said this. She and I have been on panels together, and I think you said it best, Deb. So I don't want to not quote you, where you said, now that we're all talking about equity and we're trying to do the right thing about people of color, all of a sudden there's no money. People are just saying that there's no money. And I think if we are really going to address equity, we got to recognize that we've got to invest in it with substantial resources. That is a priority. And there's some work that we're doing at IHEP with the Post-Secondary Value Commission. And Michelle Sequeiros is on this is on the commission. Millie Garcia, who's also with us, she's the co-chair of the commission. One of the things we're trying to drive home in that work is the fact that we're thinking about value from the frame of equity. And if we center equity in the issues of race and low-income students, and in the case of the Value Commission, women, and if we did right by those populations, what does the world look like? And you'll see that all the other indicators increase. Economics increase, funding increases, society, a whole host of social benefits increase. And so we really need to start framing this as the asset of focusing on equity, and not that we're catching up or we're looking at it from that deficit frame.
All right. I've been to church this morning.
You're muted there.
Who's got questions? Wow, stunned silence.
It's a softball for Deborah.
I have a question. This is Monica. And Michelle, you may have just answered it, but first you said progress is at the intersection between policy and practice. And you had mentioned 3 priorities around leadership, data, and financing. But I was curious, is there a policy priority? Like, what is the policy change that you think begins to really transition or transform into a more equitable? And maybe you're referring to the higher ed finance system, but I'm wondering if you've got a policy priority that you all are working on.
Yeah, I think there are lots of different policy priorities on the finance work. Certainly at the institutional level, there's institutional financing policy that also has ripple effects on the state level to broader, like tuition setting, tuition guidance policies. And then there's also financial aid policies that are both state, institutional, and federal as well. Right now, I think we're 7 days away from an election, and there's a lot of people talking about free college or debt forgiveness. Certainly those are also financing policies, and I think they're important ones to talk about and to think about how to fix. But what I also want us to do is not just focus all of our attention on those policies that are related to college financing that happen on the back end once the students in our institution and in repayment or through the process, but really what can we do on the front end to ensure that the way we allocate and spend the resources that we're given are done in an equitable manner and have an equity first frame in terms of accessing those funding. So, you look at some of the federal funding formulas for, things like SCEOG. Like, that is not an equity-minded funding formula at all. It is a historical artifact of years prior, and we need to fix those structures and in terms of the whole financing. So there's a lot in the financing bucket, to be perfectly honest. And I just think it depends on what level you want to focus on, what you can do, whether that's the institutional policy, the state policy, or at the federal level.
Thank you. Let's see. Sean has a question, and then we're going to go to Daisy.
Great. Thank you both, Michelle and Deb, for your investment here in California and your contributions to this group. I want to go back to a question that Lunde asked earlier that I thought was a really good one. And it was about the focus on recovery. So I recognize that there's a lot to think about and do right now in the midst of the pandemic. There are so many inequities that are being reproduced and deeply entrenched every day. But Michelle and Deb, have you seen other states that have already begun to fast forward to thinking about when the pandemic ends? How do we ready ourselves now for recovery, as opposed to waiting for the pandemic to end and then suddenly we're in this period of recovery and we're scrambling to figure out, okay, well, how do we recover? Are there other places where you're seeing the conversation being had in a preemptive, planning forward fashion?
I'll start. What the heck? I feel like we're in a safe space. We can say that. Planning ahead, no, frankly, Sean. I wish that were the case. I mean, I know people couldn't have anticipated that. To your question about the not wait, because we don't know how long this pandemic is going to continue. I think what I've seen are more conversations about eliminating the sacred cows that we've had that have limited some of the inequities. I'm seeing it in small ways. I'm hoping for this conversation to be the bellwether of what those need to be, frankly, Sean. So I'm talking to people from several states, and it's not looking promising, because at the end of the day, they all say it's about money. And it is about money, but how about if we redistribute some of the things we've been investing in that haven't made a difference towards these things? And I don't see the political will there in large measure. So I'm sorry that, and I'm looking, I promise, I'm trying to see where they are. And I'm thinking from a state policy. I see lots of examples institutionally, but I wish I could point to. I'm sorry, I don't have the answer. Maybe Michelle does, but.
Well, when you asked the question, Sean, the first word I wrote on my sheet of paper here, I don't know if you can see it, but it says no. And then I didn't want to be so negative, and I thought, man, I should hope Deborah has a better answer than no. And so I wrote, well, maybe I just don't know everything. Maybe there's 50 states, and just based on what I know, I'm just not either seeing it or I'm not really impressed. And in fact, I will say that how many institutions and states handled the reopening of their colleges, so, back in a couple weeks ago, I just have been very concerned that, one, we took to heart like CDC guidelines, but we didn't take to heart the need to do something different to serve students better than we did before the pandemic. And my greatest worry is that we're going to come out of this and our outcomes will be even worse than they were on the front end, because we didn't do anything in this period. So in terms of, being here with you all, I'm actually happy to serve on this, because I'm hoping that we can be the beacon of light that others in other states need to see. But I just have not been, I've not seen anything that I can speak to. And what I do know about is I've just not been very impressed. But I add the caveat that I don't know everything. So maybe somebody else out there can offer something better.
Thank you both.
Sorry. We need a more, we can't end on that question. We got to end on a positive question. Sorry, Sean.
Daisy's gonna bring us home. Daisy's gonna bring us home with a good question.
I hope so. Well, first, thank you so much for this conversation. Londe, thank you for creating this space for us as well. I have worked with Deborah in the past, and so it's sort of a softball for her. But just thinking through, when this is over, how are you, or the organizations that you're a part of, how are you wanting to partner with this state, with our segments of institution, so that this conversation doesn't end here? So what tools, ideas? How can we work together after this is over?
I'll always take a softball. Thanks. Thank you, Daisy. One thing I've learned being a person of color at the national stage is it starts with us. The onus is on us to show what it can be for our communities, and not waiting for others to do for us. We have to do for ourselves. And that's my way of just framing that our commitment is to find ways to partner, because it's going to take all of us to do that. Again, at Excelencia, we've come up with an approach, and it was shared, Lande and others shared the one pager for the Seal of Excelencia framework. It's an approach to try to codify what it means to intentionally serve. Maybe not perfect, but it's a way of raising standards and expectations unapologetically with a lens that's focused on students of color. So my commitment is, if you as institutions and are want to work and help even improve this, but if you want to go down this path of figuring out jointly how to make it happen, you have my commitment to do so. Our framing right now is the seal, but if you have a better way, if we can use our national platform to bring attention to good work that's making a difference, that's my biggest commitment to you all, is to find a way that we can use the leverage and the megaphone we have to bring positive attention to positive things, making a positive difference for our community. And if we can do it with community leaders of color so that we're not the afterthought, I'm all for it. So count on me, Daisy. If we can, I will be there, and we will bring others. And I know there's a lot of people here that can make it happen. So count on us for that.
Okay, let's see. Any other questions? Trying to see if there are any virtual hands raised. I don't see any.
I see Ben talking about the redistributing of existing resources. So that's a
yeah, and I guess I asked Ben because I think that is always, especially in these very lean times, that it tends to be the go-to, which is people are like, well, we just need to reallocate or redistribute existing resources. But that doesn't come without a political cost. So I'm curious as to how your proposal is being received, Ben, in Oregon.
Yeah, sure. As I mentioned in the chat, our proposal is strictly related to financial aid and reforming our so-called free community college program to focus instead, which was intended to be a universal and last dollar program, meaning it disproportionately benefits middle and upper income students when you follow the money. We're proposing to overhaul that, open it up to college or universities, and focus on the lowest income students as a first dollar program, meaning that Pell, other forms of grant aid, could support living costs once their tuition is paid for by the state. So, and California's had programs like this as well. We'll see. As I said in the chat, the politics will be challenging, but don't appear impossible at this point. And actually, given our legislators and governors' commitment rhetorically to equity, racial equity, specifically, it feels like the right moment to be leading with this type of proposal. But again, we'll see what kind of backlash ensues when sort of word gets out more generally to Oregonians. I do think that the redistribution, I mean, both panelists hit on it, and I think it's a really important place to go. And equity cannot be the thing that we do only when we have new resources, which is often the way the conversation gets framed here. We'll get to it when you give us the money. And so we continue to push back on our institutions from the state level about that kind of response, saying, no, that has to be baked in from the start. But, then it quickly becomes, well, what do you want us to stop doing? Right? Or
Yeah.
How will you stop to pay for it? And I just, that's hard.
Yeah, but I think we can, if we disaggregate our data, say things that are not working for our students of color, and there are more of those than not, stop doing those things. Here's something that I've shared at the national level, which, if you don't go high or big, what are you gonna do? For you to rethink about it, I said, what if we tied the amount of money we're spending per prisoner with the amount of money we're spending per student, and legislate that they have to be equal, and talk about controversial and political, but hell, we're in this for keeps, right? Not that that's necessarily going to be the answer, but what I know is that if we can't calibrate what we're spending, we end up spending it on the other end. That's why this long game has to be important. And I will tell you, I get a lot of flack for that, but I'm okay. It's not like we wouldn't have gotten into the space to be universally loved. How that you got to look at where are the big sacred cows out there, and we have to start questioning those rather than tinkering around the edges. And when I look at what pots of money are out there that we haven't been questioning the investment and what we get out of it as a society, I think we got to go for those big shots instead of on the edges. And at the national level, we have people try to force us to compete with HBCUs and HSIs, and that's a false paradigm that we can't let happen. So I'm saying let's go for the big dollars. Let's go for redoing that, and then see what happens.
Yeah, I think you're right about the sacred cows and this being a moment. And part of what I am interested in doing is how do we use this moment in the wake of a global pandemic, in the wake of a deep recession, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the racial reckoning. How do we use this moment to actually get us closer to what we need for our students? And so I think that really trying to figure out how we've moved some sacred cows and how we capitalize on the period of time that we're in is really, really significant. I think there are a lot of interesting ideas that have been floated. I know that Lauren Blanchard's going to have to leave us soon, but one of the ideas that came up actually last week, I think, when we were talking, was this notion of, what is it that we know that has been successful in certain places for certain students? And how do we take those ideas and adopt them here in California? And Lauren was talking about the power of HBCUs and how they have been incredibly effective at helping many African American students actually complete their degrees. And what is that about? And someone said, well, what if we took a CSU and just turned it into an HBCU? What would that mean? What would that look like? And I got so excited about the prospect of that, not necessarily because it's going to happen, although we could put that out there, but because that's the kind of, to Michelle's point, that's the kind of thinking that is not just about a single intervention, but is about a series of interventions. It's the setting of a goal and the series of interventions that completely shifts how an institution works and what it means for those students. So I'm just incredibly excited by both the energy and passion and wisdom and expertise that you all are bringing to this work. I want to say thank you to both Michelle and Deb for sharing with us this morning what is happening from their vantage points around the nation. And I want to toss it back to Susan and Carl, I guess, to take us through the rest of our day, where we're going to kind of build on this conversation in many ways and allow not just me, but all of you to also weigh in on this conversation about what are those sacred cows and what are those big ideas. So I want to say, I see Michelle just noted that these are sheroes. They are indeed. And I know that they are sheroes because many of my sheroes these days are pathologically committed to equity. And Michelle knows where that comes from. So back to you, Susan and Carl.
Thanks, Londe. And thank you, Michelle and Deb, for that conversation. Really important to keep us grounded and to make us reach high for what the big changes need to be. We are scheduled to take a break, and here's what I'm going to challenge you to do with the moments that you have before we reconvene at 5 minutes after the hour. I'd like you to take a look at the materials from yesterday and start thinking about what are the questions that you have from the materials we sent you yesterday, particularly relative to the conversation we've just had. Because when we come back, we're going to dive into that to get through initially some clarifying questions and then go right into conversation that you want to have with each other so that we can talk through these ideas given the lens that we just put on it over the last few minutes. So please stay connected. You can turn off your cameras, you can mute your microphones, and we will see you back here at 5 minutes after the hour. All right, we're going to be starting in just a couple of moments here. See, people are popping back in. Fantastic. All right, this is the show you came to see. You all are all here to have a really robust and important conversation. So Colette, let's go ahead and flip the slides. We're going to spend a couple of minutes just refreshing on where we are, and then we're going to be diving in. So first, I think it's important to know that, we've got this potential solution set on the table, and we want to hear and know what you really think about these. And given our time together so far, I have no doubt that you won't hold back, and that's particularly important today. We've given you a summary of the key themes from the student focus group conversations. And just as a reminder, as we heard from Deb and from Michelle earlier, it is absolutely critical that we design with equity as a common element in our design process. And so the quotes that you are seeing that we shared with you are from students, but they are from Black students, Latinx students, and adult students. So we may have had one or two, maybe three students who don't fit those profiles, but for the most part, those are the students that we targeted for these conversations. So important for you to keep in mind. We've given you those quotes all together in one place, just to make sure that we're grounded in who it is that we are designing for. Second, we've given you a list of comprehensive solutions, and it's a variety of different solutions that have been placed in a variety of different ways. Some of them came from this group and were not more fully developed than the conversation we had right here. Some of them were more fully developed and elevated by work groups, and some of them were things that we heard around the edges, or were things that were already in place. And then finally, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the insights that the Post-Secondary Council provided to us in a meeting last week as we presented and brought them up to speed with the materials that you all have been generating and thinking about and doing work on. And Nathan and Daisy and Lauren were there with us as well in that conversation. So go ahead to the next slide. As we're having this conversation, it's going to be important for you to know that we do have a Google Doc for you to be able to put in additional information. So as you're having conversations, as you're sitting in the background listening to conversations, if you haven't yet spoken, if you have ideas that come to you, please feel free to put those ideas also into a Google Doc so that we can capture everything that we need going forward. So thank you very much, Carl, for putting that in the chat. He's just put the link to the Google Doc in that chat. So 2 ways to interact today. So as you can tell, we really tried to give you a flavor of what students were telling us about their struggles with distance learning, about the kind of faculty support that they either don't have or wish they had in order to be successful, and their need to connect directly with teachers, as well as with the kind of support in teaching and learning that they're looking for, the struggle that they are having in basic needs support that is vastly exacerbated by the pandemic situation, by the loss of jobs, by the loss of income, and a variety of other issues, having students at home with them, children at home with them. Go ahead and flip slides, Colette, please. The emotional impacts, the toll on mental health here is significant and important. And I know that a couple of our groups have been talking about that, that students are looking for a different or enhanced type of institutional support. So some of the conversations that we had earlier, they're looking for more and different engagement with their learning experience, with their institutions that are meaningful to them in a virtual environment and beyond. And that their access to financial aid resources is really proving elusive for them right now in this situation, exacerbated by the pandemic, but the real cost of what's going on with college, and particularly for students of limited means, is different and difficult and more challenging during the pandemic. A lot of these things were already true, but important that you see the voices of these students. So let's go ahead and focus on what are some of the solutions that we put on the table for you. And go ahead to the next slide, please, Colette. We know this is small, which is why we wanted you to make sure you had your own copy nearby. And we're going to want to have a conversation about this, so we'll take this slide down here in a moment. But wanted to just walk you through a few things of import here. One is that there are some things that are currently underway. So for example, at the very bottom of the slide, you know, I think Deb's words were Deb or Michelle said, know your numbers, own your data, make sure it's disaggregated. Even if you don't like what it says, you have to own it to be able to move. You'll see at the bottom of this slide, having a statewide data system that is meaningful and allows us to understand and know what's happening with students at any given point is really important. So the institutional data matters, as well as the statewide data system and the movement of students. That work is already underway through another initiative, but many of the solutions that are listed here require that kind of a system in order to make sure that we're doing the work well and making progress, and that we can identify what's working, what's not, where we've got some challenges, where attention needs to be paid. So we know that that's moving, and so that's kind of at the bottom of that sheet. But these other solutions, statewide tool for admissions, transfer, and articulation comes from one of the working groups, right? Statewide coordinating body. That idea has come up in one of the working groups, even though it wasn't the primary one that the working group was working on. Who wakes up every day thinking about how these students are moving through the various systems? Who is bringing the systems together to make sure that they're accountable? We know you have a post-secondary council, but it really is more about what's that level of transparency? How can you put something like that on steroids? And to be clear, it's not talking about dismantling existing governance systems, but how might we enhance how everyone works together? We know from the conversations we've had here before that digital equity is a critical and important solution set that needs to be addressed. It is about post-secondary education and beyond post-secondary education. The merging of the K-12 and post-secondary early college credit environment, I know that working group has been putting a lot of muscle behind that effort to try to make sure that we've got a lot more students experiencing success and earning college credit free and early. The high-touch, high-tech advising for K-12 to post-secondary completion is one of the areas where the persistence and completion group is working hard to try to identify exactly what does it mean to be both high-tech, so that we're supporting with AI and with the use of critical data, and high-touch to support students from the time they are ready to contemplate their post-secondary journey through whatever systems leads them to a credential or degree. Holistic adult learning, really thinking about, should we be treating adult students with the same types of wraparound supports that we are contemplating for our Latinx and Black students and other students, so that they too can have what they need to complete. But also, what are the flexible delivery models that they need, given the other responsibilities that they have? And then the financial aid and basic needs being packaged together so that students understand all of the supports that they may already qualify for. Transportation, childcare support, mental health services, food or housing security support when they get their financial aid, so that it's not just about how am I paying tuition, it's also about what are those other real costs of college and how might I navigate that. Quick, rapid connection to the workforce, seamless support from K-12 to and through post-secondary, and then making sure that they're, as we've talked earlier, and I think that Deb and Michelle did a fantastic job of exploring this, you know, what does higher ed finance really look like? And while we haven't spent working group time on that, I know that the College Futures Foundations have some work in that area that they either have already completed and are taking to the next level and taking time. And teaching and learning, this group really hasn't explored in any level of depth. What does the teaching and learning environment need to look like? What does the experience need to be? for students going forward? And then, you know, what might an overall goal look like across California, across systems for an attainment goal? So those are the things that have come up. And if you flip to the next slide, Colette, this is really intended to show you kind of the connection of these individual solutions to the 10 findings that we shared with you when we were together last that came out of the research. So I'll stop there to see if there are a couple of quick clarifying questions before I turn it over to Monica, because I know she's going to share with us guidance and thoughts that the Post-Secondary Council had when they looked at the findings and caught up with some of your work. Any clarifying questions at this point? Okay, great. Then Monica, I wonder if you might share with us the experience we had with the Post-Secondary Council and some of the things that they shared. And if you could flip slides, that would be great.
Sure. If we can go to the next slide. Thank you, Colette. And thanks, Susan. Lande, I'm going to ask you to jump in certainly. And then as Susan mentioned, Daisy, Lauren, and Nathan also participated in the Governor's Council for Post-Secondary Education meeting that took place last week. Carl and Susan presented, and what I find so interesting based on this morning's conversation is actually just how aligned the systems leaders are with the direction of the task force. So just to remind everybody, the Governor's Council is made up of the systems leaders from the Department of Education, so K-12, the State Board of Ed, community colleges, CSU, UC, and the independents. And it also has representation from business, labor, as well as the Department of Finance. So when Carl and Susan were presenting the work of the task force to date, some of the responses that came up are very much, like I said, in line with what you all have been talking about this morning. So when you look to the left, those two, governance structures and systems alignment, they actually go together really nicely. So there was a question about, is this work really around redesigning the system of higher education? And if that's the case, then are we taking into account the governance structures and the fact that each one of these entities has its own governing board? Some of them are appointed, some of them are elected. Certainly when you go down and you think about local school boards who are also elected, or at the district level for the community colleges. So how are we thinking about the way in which governance is actually going to support the work of the task force and the recommendations of the task force? And what Lande clarified was that it's not about redesigning systems, it's really about systems integration. And that the design principle is around student flow. And so if you think about system integration, then how do governing bodies actually think not independently in silos, but ways in which they can connect their policies, their practices across the entire sort of ecosystem of education? A little bit like what Michelle was saying, the other question wasn't just about alignment, but and coherence and dual enrollment and many of the things that you all are talking about did come up. But how do you actually hold governing boards accountable to the kinds of outcomes that are equity focused? And what do those accountability measures actually look like? How do you advance them? Making sure that you've got leadership in those governing boards that are actually understanding of and representative of the community. So I think real alignment, and happy to have Daisy, Nathan, Lande, weigh in on that. Going down the sort of the middle of these two, when the slide went up that said prioritizing Black, Latinx, and adult students, cautiously, one of the systems leaders said, well, we operate in a 209 frame. And how do we think about that if we're going to be so intentional about directing resources and efforts against these student populations? And of course, then the question came up, and Michelle Sequeiros, who's actually on the steering committee that's working on Prop 16, what if actually Prop 209 is dismantled through the passage of Prop 16? How do we think about the implementation of moving forward as it relates to this work? So anyway, just questions around that. And then one of the systems leaders said, let's not forget, what did he call them? The breaking the cycle of exclusion around Indigenous populations. And that when we talk about priority populations, let's just not forget that in California, we have to take into account our Native brothers and sisters and that quote unquote cycle of exclusion. And then lastly, and I really like this, Londe already talked about the HBCUs. One of the members said, look, we know, and Deb, it was your point, there are places that are doing this right. So how do we actually learn from them, replicate? The example was, Dominguez Hill, Cal State Dominguez Hills, Riverside, UC Merced, there are pockets of excellence, and how do we learn? And Lauren, I don't know if you're still on, but Lauren said, this isn't just about student success, it's where students flourish. And so how do we learn and maybe use that as a model for replication? And of course, it kept Londe up all night because she got so excited about that idea. And then lastly, going to this whole issue that you all spent so much time on the system of higher ed finance, because the director of Department of Finance is a member of the council, she was like, look, we're going through a period of time where we've got limited resources. We have to think about sustainability. And so it's really not about more resources, it's about resource allocation. And, Nathan made the point, which is, I think, especially coming from a CFO at one of the systems, that, this shouldn't be a time where you spread all the dollars evenly, but you spread them equitably. And that really forces you to prioritize where you're going to put your resources against those populations that we believe might have the highest needs. So anyway, I just, Londe asked me to talk to this slide. I would ask Londe, Daisy, Nathan, Lauren, if you're still on, if there's anything else that you wanted to surface. But what I take away is, at least at that briefing, there is very consistent alignment. And what's important, and Londe said this often, these are the people that are going to carry these recommendations forward. Some of them might sit with the governor's office or with the Department of Finance, but if we don't get buy-in from the systems leadership at this stage and along the way, it's going to be really hard for them to say at the end of the process, oh yeah, let me take those recommendations and run. So I thought it was a really positive outcome, and happy to turn it back over to you, Susan, or see if there's any questions.
Any questions?
Not any questions?
Yep. Actually, Monica, this is Sean. This was very helpful to see. I want to talk about the priority student populations for a moment. I really appreciated the naming of Indigenous students. They're often a discarded group in conversations like these. So I think that's really important. Was there any conversation also about Pacific Islander students and particular Asian American subgroups? As we all know, right, when we look at Asian Americans in the aggregate, the student success picture looks, really good or comparatively much better, right? But when we disaggregate, obviously, into particular ethnic groups, the outcomes are sometimes the same, sometimes even worse than they are for Black and Latinx students. So I wonder, was there any conversation about those groups as well?
It didn't come up, Sean, but I know that at least in this task force, the very first meeting, I remember we had some conversations around that. And I also think that as we do more regional work, so in the Central Valley where you've got Hmong and Cambodian and other populations that we know are actually not achieving at the other. So I think it's going to come up, and it didn't come up in the Governor's Council.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Why don't we then go ahead and transition and to the next slide, Colette, please. And then we're going to dive in holistically. So 3 big questions for us to wrestle with today. And remember, we want to get as much directional support from you, priority support, and guidance as possible. When you look at this solution set and reflect on all that you know through your own experience and through the research that you have done, that we've done together in this group, do you see the change that it will take to truly recover with equity as we have been defining it? Why or why not? Are there items on this list that are absolutely non-negotiable, that without them, we will not do the job well? And then finally, is there anything missing? Is there something that is not yet in play that you worry about? And then, you know, we also need to be thinking realistically about where are we? What do we need to be thinking about in terms of funding, finance, how these things are all playing together? All right, so those are the questions. Meg has just put them in the chat for us so that we can kind of be grounded by those in our conversation, but I'm gonna open it up. So Colette, if you could just put us back so that we can see each other instead of the slides. And I'm gonna open it up, and my team is gonna help me make sure that I get to the raised hands for this conversation. But who might like to take the first shot across the bow as to what you think is absolutely important here and needed? Sean?
Yeah, I'll go first. Sorry to be so predictable, but I just want to maybe double click on the question that I just had for Monica. I think it's really important for us in this work to be decidedly inclusive of groups whom we know that when we look at the data, they too are also being underserved in California higher education. Again, I so appreciate the focus on Black and Latinx students, obviously, but I think it would be irresponsible of us to not also include Indigenous students and particular Asian American and Pacific Islander subgroups.
Thank you. Yeah, Mikhail.
Sorry.
I guess sort of in response to a few of these together, one of the ones that left me a little sort of feeling like we need to go deeper is on the teaching and learning box. Given the quotes and what you heard from students, and given what's in there as a solution, I think, you know, as a person who's you know, done these kinds of analyses on sort of what leads to persistence and completion, both individual determinants, but institutional ones. The biggest part is always left over, and it's unknown. And yet we hear from students over and over again about what they experience in the classroom. We heard it again from your collection around flexibility and support. So I think it's one we need to interrogate a lot more if we're really going to. It's kind of this omnipresent one. It's connected to Lauren's piece about HBCUs and what makes them different. It's connected to sort of lots of research we have from K-12 about it, having a teacher who, you know, who believes in you, and, you know, this kind of, you know, a whole bunch of research that suggests we don't have it totally nailed down. So I want to make sure we spend time just figuring out what is the solution that's proposed under the teaching and learning box a little more fully.
And I will tell you that there was not a lot of conversation in the group that you might think was going to take that one on, right? There was the conversation that happened there. And so what you're seeing is just some Ed first spaghetti at the wall kind of language, Mikhail. But the conversation in the work group was there's so much happening right now and so much innovation going on and people trying to catch up that this group wasn't sure, that working group was not sure that they could adequately do it justice without enough faculty input in the room to make that real. But I would love to hear other people's thoughts on what needs to be a part of that teaching and learning bucket.
I'll also just throw out that I think CSU in particular is really tackling this with their dashboard sort of in their 2.0 and sort of really trying to give data in front of faculty around their own gaps. I think that's really innovative. I don't know if Lauren can say more about it, but in particular, it's not just these amorphous gaps that we don't understand where they come from. It's really challenging faculty to look at their own gaps in the classroom and contend with them with a, with a lot of sort of supports on where to go from here. I know it's still emerging, but I just want to suggest that the idea that, it's always around the classroom and we leave the classroom alone, I think needs to be pressed a little bit further.
I guess I would just add to Mikal's point that, and to an earlier point that Sean was making, which is I wonder the extent to which those gaps have now broadened in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of online learning or distance learning, and what we need to do to not just think about the gaps as we understood them at the beginning of the year, but think about the gaps as we understand them unfolding right now. I think a lot of work has been done by the systems to try and provide supports for instructors to think about how they pivot to a new, educational delivery model. And yet what we are hearing in anecdotal and newspaper reports is that students feel disconnected. Students, there's a lot of information out there about what the actual student experience is and how hard it is for students to continue to learn in this mode. And we're seeing maybe some of that occur in terms of what's happening with some enrollments in some institutions. So I just think that we need to, as you say, we need to continue to interrogate that piece too, so that we're looking not just at historically what has happened, but what's happening right now in this moment, and how do we make sure that we are compensating and addressing both.
Right.
I'm trying to raise my hand, but it's not working very well. So I'm just going to jump in if you don't mind. So I wanted to mention something that I've certainly said to a few of you individually and want to offer it to the entire group. Obviously, equity challenges don't just happen on the day that a student arrives on our doorsteps in higher education. That oftentimes those equity challenges begin at the K-12 level and they follow students into higher education, which then speaks to the real importance and relevance and has a whole lot to do with some of the secret sauce work of HBCUs, of partnering authentically with K-12 schools and working with students as early as middle school and following them through high school and creating pipeline programs. And really by the time the students enter the doors of higher education, that there is a broad understanding of not only the academic challenges, but also the academic goals, the career goals, and the personal development goals, so that that student isn't foreign at all to higher education once they reach our doors. While I do believe that dual enrollment is important, I also believe that partnerships, starting as early as we can between higher education and K-12, especially middle schoolers and high schoolers, would go a long way in helping us with recovery, especially recognizing that the gap is likely to broaden even further with some of the challenges that we've had on the teaching and learning side during this pandemic.
Thanks, Lauren. I'd love to jump over to Haley. And Haley, are you going to tag in on this topic or another one?
All of the above. I just have a couple points I was going to raise, and some of them dovetail nicely with the comments that have been shared. On the topic of teaching and learning, something I wrote about the way the rec is currently phrased, it talks about being responsive to students' needs. I don't have a problem with that language, but I think it's really important to be explicitly asset focused when we can be. So perhaps we could also talk about the importance of educators leveraging students' strengths and unique talents or assets, not just talking about student needs. So that was one thought on teaching and learning. And then kind of in the same vein, just reading the set of recommendations as a whole, I was wondering if maybe the language could be a little bit more explicit or stronger about naming systems of oppression or systemic racism that's embedded in our education system. I really like the points about highlighting specific student populations. But, and I think Sean's comments are really going to help us do a better job of that in the recs. But I'm also wondering if we might want to fine tune the language about the systems. And then just one more point. I was looking at the higher ed finance structure box, and I think that's a really important topic for us to address. Right now, the language talks about financial incentives related to completion. I wonder if we also want to explicitly mention incentives for closing equity gaps. I would say, I would use the language of opportunity gaps, but a lot of other folks use achievement gap. So I'm not trying to introduce a whole wordsmith rabbit hole, but something that's a bit more than just the completion rates.
Great, thank you. And I think to Monica's point in the chat, we should review all of our language as we're building this set of recommendations for an asset base, as opposed to a deficit base. Absolutely. I think that Keith, we had you up next.
So you asked about non-negotiables. So I look at these recommendations, and the non-negotiables are teacher and learning, the financial aid and basic needs, and then also the seamless K-12 through post-secondary support. I think those three, from my perspective, are non-negotiable. The teacher and learning is something that we've been struggling with prior to COVID, and then COVID just exploited us even more. But prior to COVID, we were struggling with what was happening inside the classroom. So how do we make those changes once we come back through post-COVID-19? Basic needs is important from my perspective. It's always been important, especially for the demographics that students we're talking about, regards to financial aid, but also the food, housing, and mental health, childcare. Make sure they have the basic needs in order for them to be successful. And then a partnership, which was mentioned earlier. I just think and it's not about partnerships. I go back to, it's about relationships. How can we build and maintain these relationships with our K-12 partners to move forward? I love the word, I know the word partnership, but relationships, if we're able, the problem we have is the leadership gap, and we have leaders at the K-12, community college, and higher ed who are changing, right? So if we are able to have relationships where our staffs are more involved in these conversations, then it doesn't matter who the leader of the institution is, the relationship will maintain. And so how can we maintain these relationships with our K-12 partners and create structures for that? But those three are my non-negotiables.
Thanks, Keith. Michael, I think you were trying to get in here as well.
Yeah, thank you. I actually wanted to raise, I think, an idea that was missing that maybe we should have a little bit more conversation about. And that was regarding campus climate. And for me specifically, it was resource centers that I think are now popping up a lot more on campuses, specific resource centers for students of color and their certain identities, that they can have a home on campus. They can have a place to go where they feel more comfortable. I was a student when SDSU built the Black Resource Center, and I think I was a sophomore, and the way that you felt your community on campus was certainly different. And I think that there's a point to make about that. And there are certainly things that happen on campus that might affect the way you feel in the classroom, whether or not it's racial slurs that were yelled to certain students. And there's an incident where police officers tackled a Black student on campus, or a Black person on campus, and that created a huge uproar, and there was nowhere for students to go if they felt something and they didn't know the right place to attend. I think resource centers have a place on campus for that, and I think that there's a conversation that we could have around how resource centers can help with admission and retention, and ultimately success.
So in addition to calling out the specific types of structures that really need to be removed, it's also about calling out the kinds of structures and supports that need to be put in place.
Yeah, and I would also add maybe incentivizing having those structures available, or scaling those structures up, or having something along those lines that would actually support the building of those structures, or put them actually in place.
Thanks, Michael. And Michelle, I skipped over you, and I didn't mean to. I went from right to Michael and not to Michelle.
No problem. Yeah, no, I'm just looking at the chart and speaking at the same time, and I wrote down a couple of things that jumped out at me. And one is around the language around transfer. I think we should be as explicit as we can about transfer, and try to call it a transfer guarantee. There's just so many states that have articulation agreements, and still students aren't able to transfer. So to the extent that we can create something that is a true guarantee, I think that would be important. I think in the language around the financing component, if we can also be a bit more explicit there about, you know, at least from my vantage point, I think we should be trying to eliminate the need for students to borrow or to minimize student loan debt. And that's, you know, I think how we help students get on the path to social and economic mobility. That's how we do our part to minimize the racial wealth gap. Like that is how we lend ourselves to create the creation of a more equitable and just society. So I think if higher ed can do its part by trying to help on those financing front, you know, that's another biggie. Then I also have here, I'm sorry, I have help that I didn't. Okay, the other piece I have here is around, we were talking earlier about learning outcomes, and I think really talking of, you know, speaking to the whole notion of around quality and value. We do get at that with our here by linking, talking about workforce outcomes, but I think being super explicit about the fact that we want learning to occur that helps students get into the job market, into a quality, you know, field, highly prepared. I think to the extent that we can ensure that learning is tied to some of that would be good. I heard a little bit of conversation about the whole notion of campus culture, and that's not in our recommendations at all. And if we really do endeavor to try to replicate the ethos of an HBCU, then we've got to think about campus culture. Like that is a part of what makes HBCUs HBCUs. You've got the students, you got the faculty, the leadership, everyone's bought in to the success of the students. Everyone has this sort of cultural vibe. There is just a culture. And we've not talked about the culture and the behaviors and the mindsets of leadership and the people who work at our institutions and how they need to be dedicated to these types of issues if they are going to really create the type of outcomes for students that we want. And then I had a fifth thing. Oh, my fifth thing here is around, I think Haley, you kind of touched on this a bit, but I really think we got to think about some type of equity audit. And that's for lack of a better phrase, but something that really encourages institutions to think about their policies and their practices and how they are either helping to promote equity outcomes or not helping to promote equity outcomes, and giving them some kind of a tool to assess that kind of progress on an ongoing basis. I think institutional leaders would value that and would really find that helpful. And that's not something that we have talked about at all yet.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. And we love having coworkers join us. It's awesome. Londe, I think you're up next, and then we're going to do Tim and then over to Bridget.
Great. I feel like I shouldn't be talking because I've had a lot of opportunities to talk, but the one thing that I do feel is really important is, I think it was maybe the first or second meeting where someone said that, you know, what if we shifted our paradigm to understand that most California students don't go to a single institution, but go to multiple institutions. And I think that kind of paradigm shift requires, as was said this morning, a complete redesign of how we think about what the student pathway is. So to me, I am unapologetic about thinking about those strategies that bring our higher education systems into much deeper alignment with one another so that students can move through much easier. So this first box around a statewide tool, it's a tool, it's a mindset around admissions, around transfer, any of those things, of those strategies that can help promote and ease a student's pathway from one institution to another or through institutions, I am all for. So whether it's a common application or a dual, a common course numbering system, to me, all of those things that really start to align our institutions so that California feels more like a system and less like three segments, I think are important.
Thanks, Londe. Tim?
Yeah, I'll build on that point. I agree 100% with looking at some of those structural issues. I'll say that as we package these initiatives together, there are some connections that I think can be used to kind of present a logic. For instance, you said earlier that California is already committed to greatly improving a longitudinal data system. Well, if that's the case, then I think we can come through and leverage the fact that now there is a much stronger data system through some of these particular proposals. One of them is the one we're just talking about. Admissions, transfer, and so forth becomes so much easier to pull off in a seamless fashion when we have the longitudinal data and it's reliable and it's tracked in the same way across different sectors and so forth. In fact, I think some of these initiatives can be strengthened further. One thing I had mentioned a couple sessions ago is the notion of reverse transfer, where not only are we trying to get students to seamlessly move from one sector to another, but if they move prior to getting a degree, and if we really have a good longitudinal data system, then we can reverse those credits back to the initial institution and award them the degree that they would have earned if they had stayed a couple semesters longer and so forth. So I think, you know, the transfer and admissions tool, the early college and merging post-secondary and so forth, to a certain extent, the financial aid packaging, all can be strengthened by the fact that now California is going to have this much more robust longitudinal data system. And this is the way we're going to show taxpayers that we're going to use this longitudinal data system to the practical benefit of students. And I think the equity outcomes would be very real. One other comment I'll just make from the experience of my home institution. There may be a reason why we haven't talked as much about teaching and learning. And it's not that it's unimportant, it's just much more difficult to control from the level we're talking about here. We can create structures for better advising, better financial aid, better transfer and admissions and so forth, and do that at an administrative level. When we start to try to do equally robust things inside the classroom, and I don't even have to probably complete the sentence, it creates all kinds of issues with regard to faculty rights and governance and so forth. And the other issue, which we found at Georgia State, we've done some significant changes to administrative structures. They've tended to stay in place over a 10-year period. We've done some really ambitious things with math instruction and so forth. And it seems like 3 years later, new faculty are coming in, often bringing back the same sorts of approaches and concepts. And so it's harder to sustain those sorts of changes than it might be in some other ways. That's not me saying teaching and learning is unimportant or shouldn't be the focus of our discussions, but it's just a reality check. I think that's one of the reasons it's come up less often, is it's much more difficult to enact those changes at a statewide level.
Thanks, Tim. And Bridget, let's have you up next. And then Michelle, maybe you can give voice to what you put in the chat.
So I would just, I think the list is impressive and I think it will make a difference. I'm more interested in, my concern area is about prioritization of the list. And I've seen too many states come out of a intense planning, like kind of redesign strategy session with a kind of platter of options. And without providing the necessary scaffolding for how to make the right decisions in what order and how you would do this, you leave it to policymakers who haven't been in these conversations. And often it will actually be constituencies and power and all these other factors behind the scenes that we haven't really talked about in here that will end up making decisions. So I would say, set yourself up for success by not just letting that happen. There are some rabbit holes to avoid. I think that the governance conversation is a bit of a rabbit hole in that coming out of this, if you have this suite of recommendations, people can easily grab onto, and they often do, the idea that a statewide coordinating body is kind of the solution. And so they will start in that direction and it will be initially connected to these core principles. But we all know how bills get passed and there will be amendment upon amendment upon amendment. And I saw this happen in Oregon where the idea was good and the final outcome, there were so many changes that happened along the way, it didn't resemble anything of what we tried to accomplish. So as much as you can structure things so that it actually, we walk through how you would do it and making sure that you're extremely explicit about what it is. So you don't necessarily want just a statewide coordinating body. You're looking for a comprehensive statewide data system that is directly connected to governance, that there's a connection there and a singular focus. There are different ways that you could do that, but just be very explicit about what the actual goal is. You also have some early possible wins. Now, I know that the campuses I work with, the California institution is not doing contact tracing, but if you are doing contact tracing, that might be a backdoor to actually get you to the high touch advising system, because a contact tracing system, what we're discovering is, substitute out the metrics and the particular, the data that you're focusing on, the variables, and put in student success variables. And you have essentially created the scaffolding for a high touch proactive advising system, right? So you just sub out that you're not looking at COVID, you're actually looking at some of the things that we always needed to track. So post-pandemic, if you have if you actually did connect to the contact tracing systems, if they exist, you could actually be pretty far down the road immediately coming out of the pandemic. And that's a backdoor that people are not aware of. So I would just say, consider rank ordering, consider an ideal state recommendation where you actually walk through how you would do this. Because I would pick certain things in a specific order to ensure that you actually could achieve maximum equity outcomes, rather than letting the political rabbit holes take over. And also just being very clear about where there are things to avoid and where constituencies might be an issue.
Thanks, Bridget. Michelle Sequeiros is having trouble with her internet connection, but would love, if it's working, to have you give voice to what's in the chat, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, I think, just what I noted following Lande's comment, and certainly it's affirmed by Bridget's, is, that the biggest lever is always the financial lever in our public institutions, right? And so I've always lamented that, we talk a good game about collaboration. And when we have really strong, good leaders, there is some real progress towards collaboration that happens, but there's really no expectation to collaboration. There's really no expectation for our high schools to close equity gaps to ensure that more students are college prepared. There's no expectation truly for there to be a seamless transfer process. There's really no expectation to have faculty across segments collaborate. And so we can all say that that's an expectation and we want it to be so, but what is the financial lever, right, that the governor and the legislature could really ensure is to what we want to see happen. And that is, in my opinion, certainly through a higher ed coordinating body too, but absolutely through the budget allocations and the policies and how we prioritize them.
Thanks, Michelle. And we heard you all the way through, so that's great. I think that Lande and Gabby, you were both putting some things in around teaching and learning. I'd love to pick that thread up a little bit, just so that we can kind of put a nice little bow on that piece and bring together what the two of you were discussing in the chat.
Gabby,
Gabby or Lande?
You want Lande, I'll follow up.
Well, I was just, saying that I agree. I was thinking that I agree with Michal, that it's significant and it feels like a missed opportunity to emerge from a task force like this that's focused on recovery and equity and not have anything in there about teaching and learning. And I also agree with Tim that, and Bridget, that, when you start to go into those places where there are very strong proponents of doing things a particular way and academic senates who have ways of doing things, that we could end up spending a lot of time kind of in the opposite. It might be a case study in frustration. Having said that, I do think that there may be opportunities for us to state rather overtly and again unapologetically about what we think some of the principles are that should guide equitable teaching and learning. And maybe that is a way to open that conversation with academic and faculty senates, knowing that they will The faculty will do what they do, which it will take a couple of years to work through a process and come up with a plan for how they will do that. But if we are at least able to set the guardrails around what needs to be, then maybe that's part of inviting them into this process in a way that doesn't, impinge on their academic freedoms, but also does lift up equity as central and essential to what they need to be paying attention to.
Yeah, I'm absolutely with Londe. I just put a couple of things into the chat there. I know Sean has a lot of resources around equity-minded instruction. Sue Rankin and Associates in North Carolina. I'm sure if you could throw a bunch of things in here in terms of a toolkit for, and we could recommend a toolkit for equity-focused classrooms, whether they're online or in person. And, just 3 quick things on that line. So Pomona, before I came, made part of our criteria for reappointment, as well as for tenure and promotion, demonstration of an inclusive pedagogy. And it wasn't a separate criterion. It was part of the pedagogical criterion. And we were very explicit about it not being a teaching orthodoxy. This is not about saying what you can and can't teach or how you have to do it, but that we need to see evidence that you are making an effort and having results at making sure every student in your classroom advances from where they started. And I think that can be part of teaching and promotion guidelines. We have unions and other very important stakeholders that we would want to discuss this with, but I think it's a shared goal that we should make explicit. I also say that in climate work that we have done, and I'm sure folks have seen this elsewhere, that peer-to-peer interactions with faculty, peer-to-peer interactions with students, as well as the hierarchical interactions with the classroom really do matter in campus culture. And when you feel shamed or hurt or discarded in a classroom, that is some of the worst experience that you will have at an institution. And so really focusing on that is one way to move culture. And we also found that many faculty do not feel they have adequate toolboxes. And so it's toolboxes for leadership and toolboxes for teaching. And so being able to provide that or point people toward it and say every campus should have an equity teaching toolbox could be just say that's what is necessary. Don't prescribe what's in it, but just say it has to be evidence-based.
Great. Any other thoughts or comments on that topic? Judy, did you raise your hand?
Yes, well, I just wanted to say, I agree with so much of everything in terms of prioritizing in these solutions. Of course, for me, the pathways that Londe mentioned earlier in terms of flexibility and helping students get through, I think is really critical. All of those items that are mentioned. I think higher ed financing structure and funding inequities really needs to be addressed if we're going to make significant movement. I think Lauren mentioned earlier this seamless K-12 post-secondary support. That's important to that pipeline issue and looking at what's successful about HBCUs and what they do. And then that ties to what Michael said about campus culture. We can't not look at that because really leadership makes such a difference. We can get the students there if they're not met with a supportive environment, if we don't have faculty and staff and administrators that are sensitive to the diversity of our students, we will lose them. We won't retain them. And so leadership does matter. Thinking about implicit biases in decision-making in our policies and who serves on selection committees for faculty and administrators, all of that matters. And if we're going to come back and recover with true equity, thinking about that, we have to address digital equity. There's such a divide there. So I see all of these as so critical for us making a difference and moving the needle, so to speak, for our students. So thanks. It's good work.
Great. Keith, do you want to give voice to what you put in the chat?
No, maybe I'm a little bit frustrated regards to teaching and learning, and it's my own experience at my own institution, really pushing the faculty on the work that has to be done with AB 705 and providing professional development. And their responses are, you're infringing on our academic freedom. However, if you look at the data, our students are suffering. And so if we continue to say this is just your area, it's not. We have to really push this regards to a toolkit, regards to letting them see their data, regards to their student success rates and their retention rates. We have to push the envelope and involve the statewide academic senate involved in this conversation, because we can recruit students of color to our institution of higher education, but they have bad experiences within the classroom, they're gone. And I was lucky as a college student, because I remember my first year, my white faculty member in English said I would not graduate for UC Santa Cruz. I never forget that conversation. And my whole experience was, I'm gonna prove this lady wrong. How many other students receive that type of comments while they're in college, right? But not everyone proved their teachers wrong. So until we fix what happens in the classroom, we can recruit, we can provide all these support services, but if the faculty don't change the way they do business, our system is not going to change. And if that's the Holy Grail, then it's time to go after the Holy Grail.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. What I'd love to do is, if there are some things that you haven't had an opportunity to voice, I would love for you to either jump right in or raise your hand, because we're going to pivot here in a moment. We're going to take about a 5-minute break, and then I'm going to probably ask you to rank some things yourself and move forward. So anyone else want to give voice to some thinking?
Excellent conversation.
Oh, you're fading in and out, Michaela. Are you completely off of mute?
Can you hear me?
Now we can. Yeah.
Okay. I just want to say that, just to complement Keith's point, the academic senate conversation happening at UC right now is on the worry around student cheating in this virtual space, right? So I just, it is the hardest, and I couldn't agree with Tim more. It really is. And yet I support Keith's point, and that's exactly why we have to tackle it. I mean, UC campuses are struggling getting faculty to just even agree that a diversity statement should be part of requirements for, not just for promotion and merits, but even for hiring. So I do think that, for all those reasons, whether it's community colleges or CSUs or UCs, this conversation should happen.
Thank you.
If I could add just a little bit more here as well, both to Keith's point and to Gabby's point. There's a lot of experiences that you could have on campus. Some of them are in the classroom, some of them are outside of the classroom. But I think some of the ones that happen outside of the classroom come inside the classroom. Especially in the past few months, I think more than before, but especially in the past few months, something happens on campus, something happens in the world, you come to the classroom, you want to talk about it, and your professor is definitely not ready to have that conversation in a way that supports students of color, in a way that supports marginalized students. And so then the student there, I mean, I've seen this many times where a student is outspoken about something they're passionate about, professor has no idea how to handle it, you will never hear from the student again. They might be there, but they won't raise their hand. They're not going to participate because they already had that experience. So I just really felt that, providing some sort of resource to faculty, to campuses on maybe how to deal with some of these situations, especially as they have become a lot more prevalent on campus and in the world and in the state, et cetera, I think would be extremely helpful for students to feel some level of support, maybe from the only people that they come into contact with at the university, especially in this online setting.
Thank you, Michael. All right. So here's what I would like to do is I would like to have about, I don't know, a 5 to 7 minute break. I would love for you to put any additional thoughts into the Google Doc while we have that conversation. My team and I are going to, this is on the fly team, my team and I are going to attempt to try to consolidate some of these big ideas as you have described them into a document that we already have for rank ordering. And then have you come back into this conversation and actually put some rank orders on some of these things that we've talked about. And before we go, and Ed First team, just know I know we're doing this on the fly, so it will be imperfect. So just stick with us. We've heard that the framing needs to shift, right? That there be an expectation of equity, a design for equity throughout the system, that there's a paradigm shift around student pathways such that students are moving to and through our systems in a way that can help them complete, which means that we need to be able to expect and ease those pathways, that we need deeper alignment of our systems, things like a transfer guarantee and reverse transfer and potentially, joint admissions types of work, that our data system should allow us now to actualize a lot of this work, and we should be leveraging it going forward to make some of that work easier and have it be connected to some measures of accountability, whatever those look like. Being mindful of the cautions that you gave us, Bridget, not to go down into rabbit holes that we don't want to get stuck in or argue over or end up with in a wrong place. That related to all of this, the campus culture matters, and this notion of equity and care for our students and thinking differently about what teaching and learning looks like, that it has an equity base and a series of expectations around changing the experience that the priority students that we have been talking about have in post-secondary, and that basic needs remains important. And that as we are trying to pull our systems closer together, it's not only about structures and pathways and partnerships, it's also about deeper ongoing relationships such that we continue to do the work together earlier and help move students through. There are a variety of other things in there, including our how we are then going to finance or think about how we leverage our dollars, existing dollars, in ways that follow those key components. But those are some of the big pieces that I've been taking away from the conversation that we've had here. Does anybody want to correct or add anything to that you think that we're missing as I've been trying to listen to all of you? And I won't be offended if you think I've missed something or misstated it. All right. I'm going to give you 10 minutes because what I'd like for us at Ed First to do is to kind of go into our second Google document that we haven't yet shared and to try to scribe some of these ideas so that people can rank what they think are the more important ones that I've just tried to encapsulate. Okay, and as participants in this group, Californians and national leaders, I would behoove you to go into the original Google Doc over the next 10 minutes. And if there are things you haven't said or nuances you want to make sure that we hear and know, please put them in now. And we will reconvene at about 4:18. Information, I'm going to do two things. One is to beg forgiveness and a little bit of grace if we don't get it completely right in this last 10 minutes, but we promise that we will continue to scribe. We just want to get the general ideas down so that you have something to work with. The second thing I'm going to do is to ask, now that you've had a few minutes to reflect, anything else that you would like to say that hasn't yet been said before we go in and ask you to make some kind of forced rankings, which will be a little bit artificial, but will help us try to go back and really put some finer grain points and support behind some of what we've talked to today. So anything, number one, that you're reflecting on, anything that you think you haven't said that is important to be able to voice right now? Oh. National folks, any last pushes before we ask the full team to begin to rank order some things?
Susan, this is Ben. I'm sorry for having missed this really important conversation over the last hour. The one thing that seems potentially missing from this, and I don't know if it was discussed, was how this type of work, these types of conversations and efforts are institutionalized. What mechanism is in place to ensure a continued focus by the state of California on these topics, knowing that even if you adopt or your legislature adopts policies related to, many or all of these efforts, you're going to need continued modification, amplification of those efforts over time. And I saw that in some of the spreadsheet or some of the PowerPoint slides that came earlier, but don't see it in the Google Doc here.
Londe, I do wonder if you all, and I'm catching you mid-bite, I apologize. I wonder if there are some additional kind of what comes next after this, after the recommendations are set, that would be helpful for this group to know, kind of what do we anticipate happens next? Where are there already structures in place to carry some things forward?
So the two things that come immediately next, or come immediately after the blueprint is produced, is it will go to the council, and we have a meeting already scheduled for early December where they'll have a chance to review what we've come up with and to think through, are there immediate steps for implementation? Are there places where they feel like they need to do more work? How do these things actually practically roll out in terms of the institutions themselves? So, and what the state can do to support it. So that's the first place it will go. And then the second place it will go is directly to the governor. And the reason for that is I think this piece around really aligning the incentives in the right way to deliver on the blueprint and the elements that are there, those one or two things, or having him take one of these and decide this is exactly where I want to go and I want to put this moonshot out as the guiding, the North Star really for the higher education system. So he will want to look at it and think about what he wants. The council will also be looking at it and figuring out how they want to take it and implement it. I think that what we do need to do is to continue to do two things. One is this is only a set of ideas, this blueprint. And if we really want to see movement on it, then I think it's going to require us to do a whole set of a rollout really around it. And so we are actually starting to think about that, at least in terms of having a permanent digital presence for this work and how we think about a social media campaign to roll out some of these ideas. So that piece is already in play, but I think we want to do more convenings and engagement with stakeholders to make sure that we're doing that work. And some of that is going to be, making sure that some of the faculty groups have a chance to really wrangle with some of this, and that we insert this into some of those processes as well. So that is the next couple of steps that I expect will be in the early part of 2021. The other thing I would like to be able to do is to periodically convene this group, because I think, having been a part of the thinking around this, that this is the group that, one, is best positioned to be champions of this work, and two, best positioned to make sure that everyone is being accountable to what we come up with, and to really work through challenges as those challenges come up. So my hope is that we will be able to continue to have some conversations amongst this group from time to time without completely taking over your calendars.
Thanks, Londe. Ben, is that what you were hoping to learn?
That was helpful. I mean, I think that my question or suggestion was really about, the long run, sort of after the governor, after your system leaders have moved forward with one or more of these recommendations. How do you ensure that there is that this conversation and the refinement of these strategies, the evaluation of these policies continues, right? With this sort of systems-wide equity-centered lens. Again, that's what I was sort of curious about.
Okay. Well, and Londe, given everything that you've shared and some of the thoughts and expectations that this group has discussed, I think that's something that is important for you all to reflect in the Google Doc, how you think that might happen. If there's a existing solution on recommendations for going forward, and to Monica's point in the chat, it's really lovely to depend on people of goodwill. But, as people change positions and move on and others come in, we need to have a way to make sure that these things are tethered together in a way that is going to be meaningful and accountable, or we haven't done our work for students, right? All right. So here's what I'd like for you to do. And this is, I know, a little jarring, but we're going to try it anyway, because I think it will help us a bit. We're going to ask you to take a look at a Google document where we've tried to, at least in shorthand, we've got all of we've been taking notes verbatim in the background, but in shorthand for now, we've captured these big ideas that we've talked about today. We're going to ask you to rank order them, 1 through 5. 1 through 7, however many there are on that list, rank order them, okay? And so you're going to do that by putting a number next to them, 1 through 10. We want you to keep a few things in mind as you do that. What are the most important pieces of this puzzle that have to be in place to best serve our students of color, and in particular, our Black, our Latinx, our Indigenous students, and others, and our adult students in the future? And we're talking 2 or 3 years down the line. What is going to matter most to making sure that our students make it through? Second, what are the most important pieces of the puzzle that will allow us to practically make this real? It's a moonshot, but we have to do it, right? So through resource allocation, through making real change on campuses, keep those things in the back of your mind as we're moving forward. What is going to make that fundamental change for our students real? So, Carl, if you could put the Google Doc in to the chat, the link to the Google Doc. And do you have, now I've been talking and you all have been making the last minute changes. Do you have any other additional directions that people should have? And I'm not looking for your initials. I'm really just looking for, I'll let you give any directions on this, Carl, that you want to give.
It's super back of the envelope. So there's a column for every task force member. You just put your first name in the first row of the column. And then I think we have about 13 solution ideas that have been kind of brought up on the table, just as best as you can. And maybe some you don't even want to rank. They don't get ranked, but as best as you can, from 1 being, highest priority to 13 being lowest, how you might try to give your opinion about how we would prioritize the items on the list.
And Carl, I believe at the top of the document, there's a little bit of additional explanation as we've discussed it, and then there's just a line that gives you the descriptor. Where you're going to plug in your ranks. Okay.
No, sorry,
So
Susan.
what-
Well, let me screen share real quick just so people can see the same thing, because
Great.
there's two different there's two charts. So there is one that kind of gives quick updated descriptions about what we discussed today, where you can just give your comments. Down here is where there's an actual ranking chart that you can easily just, in the row for each one, put your number, 1 to 13. And as I said, you may only want to rank 5, which is okay. And you assume that others are just unranked. So we don't want to have to exhaust you in thinking about what may come 10th or 11th. But you could definitely then put what you think deserves a ranking in the order that you feel like it's warranted. And yes, Susan, you had a question. Yeah, the order matches the top group. So the descriptions that we have are the same that we have at the bottom. The only one that was really added was the institutional culture and mindset shift that we added to the list. All the others were the similar topic names. We just added some updated descriptions based around what we discussed today. And some we didn't have the chance to update, so they just are kind of what was in the pre-reading.
And Carl, if we have time, we could add qualitative points to the
top. Yes, the top section. If you want to just add some other thoughts around it, absolutely.
Great. So I'd love for us to take about 10 minutes, go through your rankings. Feel free to come back and ask any questions during that 10 minutes that you might have. And while we may or may not be able to see what the top vote getters are right now, we will go back very quickly and do that and communicate it back to you after this meeting. So let's take a few minutes. When you're finished, just put done in the chat so that we know when we get a good complement of people finished. Any thoughts, comments that you'd like to share?
Well, I put it in the chat, Susan, or in one of the points, but I do think to Monica's point of how we institutionalize this, if you put in funding incentives, then you get the people of good intention, but then you also get the people who are just being utilitarian. And if we orient our funding incentives around trying to promote equity and those, closing those attainment gaps that we saw in Michelle's IHEP document, that will outlive all of us.
Yeah, Ben.
Just agree with Nathan.
Okay. Anyone else? Any reflections? Anything surprise you from what you're seeing your colleagues prioritize here? Mikkel?
I was going to say the state, I was having a hard time thinking about the statewide coordinating body, if it is useful for sort of monitoring, incentive, you know what I mean? Like where its role is within these other focus areas. And so, to the extent that a statewide coordinating body also tackles things like articulation and transfer, right? Then it's sort of, so I was just sort of there hard to rank across. Those are kind of different animals. Governance.
Thanks, absolutely.
Focus on governance.
Yeah, absolutely. Bridget, I think you had your hand up too.
No? That was earlier. Sorry, I didn't take it down.
Okay.
Susan, the only other thing I'd say, and I'm sorry, I had to miss, I had to go to another meeting when you were having the robust discussion. So this may have come up, but I also think that, we're such a large state and we have so many regional differences that focusing on regional partnerships and regional opportunities to reach our statewide goal are really important. And, we had a presentation on this program mapper that almost took individual community colleges and mapped them with CSUs or UCs. And if we set a baseline there and provided funding incentives, that may be a way that we can roll up a lot of small wins into a big aggregate moonshot.
Thanks, Nathan. So build on the good work already there. Raise it up. Absolutely.
Can I go, or do I have to raise my hand, but I don't know if it works?
Go for it, Keith.
So I just want to touch on the comment from Nathan in regards to the program mapper. And I was in a meeting last Friday with Cal State Dominguez Hills, and I was talking about the Cal State University Bakersfield and Bakersfield College and the program mapper, and how the California Community College did an RFP about that a year ago, and Compton's is participating. But I think that has potential, especially when you talk about the one item about the transfer and that one seamless system, because that you can be able to do maps from dual enrollment to transferred to a four-year college or university. And I think there's a lot of potential, especially in regards to providing students with information about their particular major and what courses they have to take throughout their progression starting in high school. And I think that could be a system that we can leverage. And thank you to the College Futures Foundation for funding for Compton for that, and also for funding for the with Dominguez Hills. No, it's invaluable. It's really amazing the work we're doing with that.
Yeah, Keith, we started when I was at UC Merced. We started it with both Merced College and Bakersfield College, and it's its first year. It's pretty remarkable.
Great. And Daisy, thank you for the notes in the chat. We'll absolutely follow up on that. Looks like a joint invitation. All right. I'm going to turn it over. Here's what we'll look to do is we're going to go through this data. You can see for yourself kind of where things are starting to emerge. We're going to take that back as a team at EdFirst and with Lande and try to pull these together to make some sense of it and provide some additional direction to the working groups based on the experience that we've had today, and build a framework to send back to you to comment on, so that when we gather next, you can see how some of these things are starting to fit together. So that will be the work that we do from your good guidance today. Carl, I'm going to turn it over to you and Lande from here.
Great, thanks, Susan. And I'm just going to be, we are just going to kind of walk through what next steps are on the horizon between now and our next meeting on the 10th. So Colette, if you could pop back up, and I'll just do our last few slides, and then I'll turn it over to Lande to adjourn us. So next slide, Colette. Very simple, as normal, we will immediately send out the summary notes from this call, and also send out the survey link for the normal feedback survey that we do. Thank you all so much for filling the survey out, and we absolutely look at every response that gets sent, and we use that to just make every meeting from that point forward even better. So appreciate you all doing that. Next slide, Colette. So we're going to be really busy over the next couple of weeks, as we've been. Working groups are actively still in solution development, and so many of them are meeting periodically over the next 2 weeks and beyond to take all the good feedback that you all are providing and flesh out, robust, full recommendation solutions that kind of Susan mentioned. We will pull those together and kind of have a nice framing for you to review, like how those more formal recommendations are taking shape during our next call on the 10th. Part of that, kind of as Nathan described, we'll continue to consult with technical advisors and resources as we need to. So whether that is the good examples of the folks that we saw with the program mapper at Bakersfield, or just other good colleagues that you're pulling into the work, please, if there's other things that have come up today that you feel like they're great examples, people, I saw some comments in the chat, we welcome that. So you can either add those in the Google Docs that we provided, or you can send us a note directly, and we'll make sure that we funnel that information back to the working groups to consider how they want to engage those technical resources in the finalization of these solution ideas. And then lastly, equity was always at the center of how we were designing this process. And so we had, on the front end of this work, made sure that we went to the 5 regions and to other statewide stakeholders to do our in-depth conversations and to just really hear their voices and their insights and their expertise to inform our work. Another big part of that was to come back to those stakeholders, to let them know how our work has been emerging and evolving over time, and to share with them some of the ideas that are emerging on the table that we've been developing. And so we'll be doing that over the next week or so, where we'll be sharing back to all those regional statewide stakeholders what our findings have been from the research and the conversations that we've been holding during this process, and then also give them a flavor of some of the ideas that have been generated through the process, just to, allow them to keep us honest. Like, do our ideas reflect the needs, the desires, the plans, the successes that they communicated to us? Like, do they see them reflected in our findings, and also do they see us addressing the things that they elevated as priorities? Do they see those reflected in our solution ideas? We're not promising them anything in terms of what's going to make the final cut or exactly what's going to be formally recommended to the governor of the council, but we do want them to know that we care about their thoughts and that we want to make sure that any reflections they have on how our work is evolving over time, they have a part in that process. So we'll be doing that over the next week or so, and sharing that back with you all, what we heard from them when we do our next meeting on the 10th. And then next slide, Colette. So to tee up, our November 10th meeting is our final meeting, formal meeting for this phase of the task force. We will be finalizing with your input and your review a set of solution recommendations that we will want to advance to the governor and to the council. A big part of that interrogation and finalization will be discussing with your good thinking, how do they rank in terms of action and impact? Is there any kind of timing considerations that we need to be mindful of when we're looking at a certain recommendation? And then just risk mitigation, like what do we need to make sure that we are on the front end and being proactive about to make sure that we are giving every recommendation the best shot at being successful and being implemented. And then lastly, as you all kind of talked about, like you mentioned this, Ben, this work will need to move forward and continue beyond the formal task force. So we want to get your thinking about the best way we're going to disseminate this information, who we need to talk to, making sure that there's any kind of post-release engagement we need to do with stakeholders and decision makers. We want to get all your good thinking around those next steps when we're together again on the 10th. And then looks like I'm looking at your question, Keith. Well, one of the subcommittees was talking about teaching and learning. So yes, so what we're going to do is now that we have this ranking process done, we'll take that back on the EdFirst side and just kind of assess like what that looks like in terms of priorities the group want to elevate with some ideas over the others. And then the EdFirst team, we're all working with the different working group members to adjust in real time and flex and advance these solutions as we need to with the good feedback that we're getting. So as teaching and learning kind of elevates, we will then be able to kind of take that back to the group and let the working groups decide the best place for that to live, and then integrate that into whatever final solutions are being developed. So yeah, our next meeting is on the 10th. We will definitely do our best to get pre-reading out as early as possible. We promise it will not be the day before. But as Susan said, we appreciate some grace because we are literally, as you all know, because many of you are on these working groups, we're in real time developing these out and fleshing them out as we're getting good feedback and good information. And so with that, Colette, I believe the next slide is our departure slide. So you can come off of screen share, and then Londe, I'll let you either take any additional questions before we wrap up or let us go.
Yeah, does anyone have any additional questions or final comments, thoughts, or feedback for us before we go off and do this deeper piece of work, both collectively and through the work groups? I'm not looking at the raised hand. I'm looking to see if people look like they have something to say. I don't see anything. Okay. I just want to say thank you. I first want to say thank you actually to EdFirst because we've been in conversation with them about how to make this meeting feel most impactful, I think, in terms of really surfacing all of the ideas that people have and really feeling like we're having the deep conversation so that collectively we're getting to a place of solutions. And I think I feel really good about this conversation. I feel like I have a really good sense of where everyone's at. It was really interesting to see the rankings. I see a lot of energy around the finance piece. And I think that's both exciting and a little daunting. Daunting insofar as I cannot imagine what we can put together in the space of 2 or 3 weeks around higher education finance. And so, and I would also say, and I know Monica had to jump to be on a call with my boss, but College Futures did and Nathan was a part of it as well. This was before we knew each other, Nathan. But the College Futures had a kind of 1.5-year study of higher education finance and what could they do about it. And the conclusion, the big takeaway from that was it was really, really hard. It is really hard to try and figure out how do you shift sources of funding. It is really hard, especially in this moment when we're in a recession, to think about how do you come up with new sources of funding. We also saw Prop 13 go down just for facilities in March. So the funding question is a really hard question. It's not to say we should stop pushing, but I just am concerned that we won't be able to get any place that's going to feel satisfying on a recommendation around higher education finance between now and December. But what I will ask Monica to do, if she's able, which is to share some of those resources that she developed, because it might be helpful for other people to know just kind of the expansiveness of the work that was done there, because it was pretty expansive. I don't know if Nathan, you want to add anything to that?
I do think it's really daunting, and we were trying to do a sort of an overhaul. I think there are opportunities, though. I mean, if we are really trying to focus on increasing transfers, especially from Black and Brown students, I think there are ways to these partnerships where you can do it with smaller amounts of money. I mean, for example, in the UC system, our funding allocation, which we call rebenching, gives about, right now it's about $8,500 per California undergraduate. If we had a program that where we were able to give, $2,000 for every new transfer student above a baseline between campuses would, they'd fall all over themselves to do that, both at the community college and at the CSU UC level. So, that's where you could start to see putting together something with, with $50 million or something, and not overhauling the whole $20 billion superstructure.
Yeah. I think
did that make any sense, Londe?
Yeah, it did. To me anyway. I don't know. Okay, so I'm going to cede you back 7 minutes of your time. I am just enormously grateful for your contributions. I've been trying to reach out to almost everyone to connect and touch base. If I haven't had a chance to have a one-on-one with you, expect one soon, and just know that I'm just really, really grateful for your time and for your contributions here. And if there's anything that you think I should know or we should know, also don't hesitate to reach out and let me know, because we're trying to land this plane in the next 4 to 6 weeks. So I really thank you all for all of this work. Okay, Carl and Susan, thank you so much. And we'll see you guys again on the 10th. Take care.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Colette, are we able to save the chat? Awesome. Thank you. All right, I'm signing off.
Just emailed it to you.